back end of YouTube. Oh, there we go. Hold on. End of YouTube. Oh, there we go.
Are we recording? I don't see anything, Christina. Oh,
we are good to go. You can start.
Okay.
Thank you, everyone, for being with us.
Thank you, everyone, for your patience. Welcome to Phil Halton and Ele Pawelski in Conversation. My name is Heather Wood, and I'm a publicist with Dundurn Press, and I'm here to introduce the evening with Phil Halton, author of Blood Washing Blood, and Ele Pawelski, author of The Finest Supermarket in Kabul. I'm just going to briefly read you everyone's bios, and I see my head's cut off, so I'm just going to move backwards a little bit. All right. Phil Halton has worked around the globe as a soldier and a security consultant, including in Afghanistan. He is the author of the novel This Shall Be a House of Peace and the new nonfiction book Blood Washing Blood. He lives here currently in Toronto. Ele Pawelski has lived in Afghanistan, South Sudan, Bosnia, Kenya, Uzbekistan, and Kosovo. She has climbed in the Himalayas, walked the Camino, and hiked in Newfoundland. Now residing in urban Toronto with her husband, she's always planning for her next travel adventure. Her stories have appeared in magazines, journals, and newspapers, and The Finest Supermarket in Kabul is her first novella. I'm just going to tell you a little bit about each book. Phil's book is a non-fiction book that very extensively researched. We were just talking about his very long bibliography all about the roots of the conflict in Afghanistan. Rather than beginning with 9/11 or the Soviet invasion of 1979, he posits the current conflict in Afghanistan began with the social reforms imposed by Mullah Amir in 1919. Western powers have failed to recognize the legitimate grievances are driving the local population to turn to insurgency. The issues they are willing to fight for have deep roots, forming a 100-year-long social conflict over questions of secularism, modernity, and centralized power. Ele's novella is set in Afghanistan in one day in 2011. It's the story of three divergent characters who end up in the same place at the same time when a suicide bomb detonates. Mirza, a new and a naive parliamentarian, receives armed threats after he wins his seat. Alec, an American journalist, looks for a scoop on modern daily life in the ravaged capital. Elisa, a Canadian human rights worker, gets unwanted attention from a powerful male magistrate. These three diverse perspectives collide in the dramatic and savage bombing that happened at this supermarket, and none are ever the same. Alrighty. Phil, I think I'm going to start with you first. Do you want to tell us a little bit about the research that went behind your book? Because, as you said, you have an incredibly long biography, well, bibliography, and biography too.
Sure. Yeah. Well, I mean, a lot of certainly the broad strokes of the book, the themes of the book, I knew from my experience in Afghanistan and from conversations with people in Afghanistan. I moved in a lot of different circles there. I knew people on both sides of the conflict. And so I had a sense of what the book would be about. But the research I did here in Canada was partly to satisfy my own curiosity, and to make sure that I really did understand the roots of things. And so not only did I have, access to a wonderful library here at the Canadian Forces College that let me access lots of journals and the rest of it, I found there was actually like a lot of academic work that had been done in the last 100 years and then kind of forgotten about. A lot of American academic work in the 50s and 60s, German work in the 30s and 40s, Turkish work in the teens and 20s. And so I read all those articles and read those books and then dug into their bibliographies and then read all of that and then dug into their bibliographies. And I just kept digging deeper and deeper and deeper. And ended up buying a lot of kind of forgotten books, PhD theses that had been published and never really accessed again. But that gave me the grounding that I needed to write the book.
That's fascinating. Do you think there was a reason behind like all that research that happened in the 50s that sort of fell by the wayside? Other things became more important in the geopolitical concerns, or?
Well, I think that's some of it. I mean, there's
Yeah.
a lot of American aid flowing into Afghanistan in the 50s and 60s, a lot of agricultural aid. And so there were a lot of academics who were writing about economics and agriculture. And that was a place where they could study, but also in some cases they could advise. And so their theories were being put into practice.
Okay.
By the 70s, that aid was drying up. And so I would imagine that funding for research also dried up. And then the Soviet intervention really made it impossible.
Right. That makes sense. Elle, why don't you tell us a little bit about your background and what got you working in Afghanistan in the first place?
I went to law school, and when I was finished, I secured a job in Toronto for a year. And after that job ended, I was surprisingly a little bit indecisive as to what I wanted to do next in my career. Phil's smiling. I don't know if that happens to a lot of people, but I had an opportunity to go overseas. This was in the late 1990s. At the time, the Canadian government was interested in trying to promote more civilian Canadians working overseas. So I ended up getting a position with UN Women in Kenya. That was my first overseas job. And I was able to work on a big advocacy project around economic rights for women in Africa. And it was absolutely fascinating to me. After that, I came back to Canada, worked in Ottawa for a year with an NGO, but was so drawn to going back overseas that I worked in the countries that you mentioned at the very beginning. And the job in Afghanistan, I can't remember how that came up. I might have known someone, or it might have been a job that I responded to. And this was in 2007. Things were looking pretty decent back at that period of time. And I went over and I worked there for a year and a half.
And you said, I believe you said at the time that you worked in Afghanistan, it was a relatively stable period?
Yes, it became much more unstable after I left at the end of 2008. The Taliban were operating quite extensively in southern Afghanistan. I was living in Kabul, and the Taliban were not very present there at that point in time. And there were a lot of Afghans and non-Afghans who were working in various sectors to promote the economy, to promote human rights, to promote access to justice. It seemed like a very thrilling period of time. I was working with judges, and we were working on how to get access to education for defense lawyers. There was some work being done on a way for judgments to be conveyed to judges outside of Kabul. So lots of things that seemed to be going on. It was very alive to me at that point in time. And my story takes place a few years after I've left in January of 2011. There was a bomb attack on a small supermarket in the neighborhood where I lived. It was quite close to me. I used to go shopping there frequently. And I'd already moved back to Toronto, but the story just was very shocking for me. I didn't know anyone who was involved or hurt, but it still really hit home for me. And a month after that is when I decided I would try to write a book about it.
Okay, cool. We'll come back to that.
Yeah.
Phil, so you first served in Afghanistan as a soldier. Can you talk? No,
that's not true.
Oh, that's not true. Okay.
No, sorry, we'll go on. But
okay, no. Could you actually just tell me a little bit about your first trip to Afghanistan? Because I know you've been there several times. So
yeah. Well, it was in 2001, actually.
Okay, so wow.
Wow.
And so I actually went to Pakistan to do some mountaineering on holidays, and
wow.
hired a car to take me, like a Jeep, to take me across the north of Pakistan through the Shandur Pass and into Western Pakistan, and then down sort of through some of the northern tribal areas. And my driver was Pashtun, and who had family obviously on both sides of the border. And so at the time he said, "Hey, like, do you want to do a detour into Afghanistan?" I said, "Yeah, sure, why not?" So we did. We went across into Afghanistan and hung out with his family and saw parts of the country that are just gorgeous, like beautiful mountains and all the rest of it, and came back into Pakistan and did a little bit more travel, and then I came home on September the 9th, 2001.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. Yeah. So
Very interesting.
and I
So
went back to work there in 2003. I've actually never been there as a soldier.
Okay, right. Okay, that's interesting. How do you feel as a Canadian soldier? I mean, that was Afghanistan was where Canada first had casualties amongst the defensive forces, and like the first times since the Korean War. Was that like a really strange thing for people in the military?
Well, that's not true either. I mean,
yeah, I guess that's true. Yeah.
Yeah, like when I served in Yugoslavia as a soldier, my squadron took casualties, and so did the engineer squadron in my camp. And so, I certainly the number of casualties is very different.
Yeah.
But I would say that the intensity of the fighting, we hadn't seen in the Canadian Army since 1993 in Croatia.
Right.
And before that, the Korean War. Yeah, I think that's it's a watershed moment for the Army as an institution, for sure. Though it's receding in the past. There's lots of young soldiers who've enlisted today who don't really even know where it is on the map, right? Like it's
right, or they weren't even born.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Wow. That's cool. Elle,
well, I have to say I'm quite jealous of. Oh, I would say I'm quite jealous of your travels. All of the time that I was in Afghanistan, I was in Kabul or just outside of Kabul. I didn't see very much of it.
But yeah, I was really lucky, because I lived all over. I lived in Mazar-e Sharif. I lived in Kandahar and Jalalabad. I've been to every province, and I've driven the whole ring road actually in a taxi cab. That I owned. It was my taxi cab.
Wow.
But
the ring road is.
Yeah, but like the yellow and white Corolla taxis that you see everywhere. It's a very nondescript car to drive, right? Like nobody bats an eye. It's just another taxi. So yeah, I've been lucky in that sense.
Oh my God, what a totally different experience you had. The ring road is actually part of my story. There's a taxi that one of the characters takes to get a story in Kandahar or near Kandahar.
Yeah, that's a terrible drive. Actually, like that Kabul to Jalalabad to Kandahar drive is awful.
How long does it take?
Longer than it should, because it's not a long distance.
Okay.
But that's like a 2.5 day drive, I guess. Like, yeah.
Wow. Okay. Interesting.
Wow.
So, Elle, I remember originally when I first met you as a writer, you were first trying to write nonfiction, more of a kind of a memoir kind of thing, and you ended up switching and writing fiction. Why did you choose to do that?
When we first met, of course, Heather, we met in a writing group, and I was quite gung-ho on trying to write a memoir because at that point I had moved back to Toronto, but I lived in 5 or 6 countries, and I had some really big ideas about what this memoir would look like. And then I started to read stories that were submitted by other writers in the writing group, and became more enamored with the idea of how much fiction can work better for you. If there are gaps, you just fill them in. If you want things to happen, you create characters. And that to me seemed a more pleasing way to tell some of the stories that I wanted to tell. And what's great about fiction is you can still get in some of your nonfiction aspects. For example, the third character in my book, there is fashioned somewhat after me, and there's a scene there where she's having dinner with her mother. And when I wrote that scene, I was picturing myself having dinner with my mother. And in the scene, the character is talking about I was securing her first job overseas. And that's sort of what it was like when I first told my mother I was going to be moving to Kenya.
Hey, cool.
Yeah. I think that like good fiction and good nonfiction serve truth, right? That you can't write fiction that's not a compelling fiction that doesn't have like truth at its heart. And sometimes that's the easiest way to get those truths across, actually, is fiction.
Yeah, I think that's a very fair comment. Of course, I don't have anything near the research that you put into your book, which is fascinating in and of itself. Yeah.
Yeah, but I don't mean truth in terms of like all the truth, like all the facts, right? But because that's a disease, and frankly, trying to get all the truth in one book. But that there's something at the heart of it, at the core of it, that rings true, right?
Yeah, I think that's.
Yeah, I mean, maybe. Yeah, I mean, Heather, you're right. Or I mean, maybe that speaks to the emotional elements of the story, or the pieces that keep you reading and keep you attached to it.
When you wrote your novel, Phil, also set in Afghanistan, how was that experience different than writing the nonfiction? Like, was it easier, harder?
Yeah, in some ways it was easier because you can make stuff up, as we said, right? That it has to ring true. It has to, but yeah, you can go.
That's true.
And I picked because it's really the origin story of the Taliban. But I don't say that it's that until the very end. And there's a lot of different legends, if you will, about how it all started. So I picked and chose the pieces I liked and made a coherent story out of it. So yeah, I think in some ways it is easier. Though I wouldn't say that. I guess it's easier in a different way, because with nonfiction, you don't have to make anything up. If you just have to go find it, so that's, as long as you're willing to do the work to go find it, then it's all there for you, right? Like, and I'm switching back and forth. Like, I've written 2 novels since this, and a nonfiction book as well. So like, I see myself going back and forth.
Okay, that's very interesting. Did you feel that your novel informed your nonfiction writing, since they were about the same topics? Like, did you?
Yeah, in some ways, because again, I had had kind of a message with the fiction book as well, which is, the message is basically that we don't understand what's going on in Afghanistan. That we've sort of othered the enemy and decided that they're not rational and they're evil and the rest of it. But nobody wakes up in the morning deciding to be evil. Like, everybody's the protagonist in their own life, right? In their own story. They think they're the heroes. Mm-hmm. So that's what I wrote, was really that this is it's coherent. It's a coherent thing. And in fact, I saw their moral journey as one that the reader could go along with to a point. And I'm always curious to know, like, when people have read that book, at what point did you decide that you were off the boat? Or was it at the very end where you go, oh, I didn't realize they were the Taliban, now I'm out? Or was it somewhere else along that journey? Because it's rational, like, it makes sense. And then so with Blood Washing Blood, it's the same thing. Afghans don't fight each other because that's what they do, or because they've always had a broken society or whatever. Like, there's a rational reason why things are the way they are. You just have to spend the time to find it.
Do you think that the fault of Western powers is they haven't been finding the reasons why the Taliban were and the previous insurgent groups in Afghanistan were attempting to do things? Like, did they never really understand the region that they were attempting to meddle with?
Oh, yeah, I think so. Yeah. I still think to this day that we don't accept that, look, the Taliban have legitimate grievances. And also that the Taliban aren't some kind of like invading force from somewhere else. They're Afghans. They're a segment of Afghan society who are unhappy with the way that they're being governed. And so, the solution to that is a Afghan political solution. It's not there's no military solution to it.
Right. When you were working with judges in Afghanistan, Elle, how did you find that situation as a Western person trying to advise them or help them out? Like, were they essentially looking to have Afghan-centric solutions for their judicial problems?
Honestly, I feel like I can answer that question in so many different ways. I worked in an international position in many different countries over a 12, 13, 14-year period of time. And I think it's always tricky with having folks that are not from your country providing you with advice. And sometimes it's welcome. Sometimes it's welcome in an obvious way. Sometimes it's welcome, but not by everyone. And sometimes it's just put up with for reasons that I, in the position I was in, wouldn't know. But a lot of the assistance and aid that gets provided around the world today, I think, is mostly political, or the underlying aims of it are political. It's part of the reason I'm not doing that anymore as a career. It just felt a bit overwhelmingly insincere to a certain degree. So when I was in Afghanistan working with judges, I think that they were interested in working with me, probably not so much for the ideas I was bringing, but more for some of the other accoutrements, because the program that I was working on was trying to produce these bench books, which would be books that would have decisions that judges could refer to. So here in Canada, that's very easy to find. You just go online and you can see what judges are writing. There, it was much more challenging. So I think some of the results would have been more attractive than potentially the actual delivery. And as a woman, it felt very challenging to me. At a certain point, I suggested to my bosses that perhaps somebody who wasn't in the position I was in my organization, but was a man, would be able to have a better stream of communication with these male judges. And I kind of withdrew from that piece of the project a little bit, or took a step back.
That brings me to...
So all I can say is it's tricky.
It's tricky. Yeah. And fair enough. So that brings me to several questions. I guess, what is your responsibility as writers now, as opposed to being consultants or, writing about a place like Afghanistan that's not your culture, it's not your country, and that, outsiders have, for at least 100 years, caused problems in? And how do you present this culture in this country to other people?
Yeah, I think that's a tricky one. And I part of it for me is that I think that there's not enough being written about Afghanistan in English that points people to Afghan points of view to dig deeper into.
Okay.
And so I would see the book, even though I spent a lot of time doing research, a lot of it was to find those original sources, those Afghan sources, and to point people back to that. I've got, I'm entitled, I feel, to my opinion about how things are based on my own experiences. But I don't think that that's, the final opinion. And I really encourage people to find those Afghan voices and hear it from essentially from the source. Because, as Elle and I were lucky enough to have spent time there to see it and to hear it from the source. But most people don't have that experience.
Right. Elle?
Yeah, that's a really great question. And of course, it's a question that writers are grappling with, not just today, but historically. I think it's more relevant today as writers, or as writing, I think, becomes more accessible, and more people may feel that they can take up writing more easily as an artistic pursuit. And I got to thinking too about my book, and maybe I'll tell it from this perspective. I have a Facebook page that has been created just for my book, and I get so many likes on it and so much interest from Afghans who, I'm going to guess, by and large, wouldn't be able to read the content because it's all in English. And I don't quite know what they would be hoping to gain out of expressing interest in liking my Facebook page, but it got me to thinking about who the audience for my book is and whether an Afghan reading my book would enjoy it. And I've written it, and I'm Canadian, and I think mostly it would be something that would be of interest to folks from outside of Afghanistan. And if I wanted, not that I would want to write a book addressing Afghans about the situation in Afghanistan, but I think that would be a whole different book and would want to be written by Afghans. All to say, because I've lived there, for me, a lot of what appears in my book are things that I saw or experienced. And so that to me is very authentic, but it's still authentic from the perspective that I've taken. And that there could be a lot of other books being written, as Phil's pointed out, by Afghans about Afghanistan. And they could very well be novels. I think that would be great and very interesting.
Yeah. I suspect it will. I mean, we've had a bit of Afghan literature sort of flowering in the sort of the earlier mid 2000s. Maybe we'll have some more. And I think I would now, especially, I'm wondering what will happen once the American troops will finish their withdrawal. We'll see kind of a next cultural kind of movement over there. So, Ella, you were mentioning your experience with the male judges.
Yeah, it would be nice to see.
Yeah. Yeah. No, go on. Yeah. Yeah.
Just wanting to see books written by women about the experiences of women in Afghanistan. I think that there's a lot to be said about what's happening with women and their own perspectives on life and what they see in the future. And again, I think it would be great to see that in the form of novels, amongst other types of items coming out of there. Sure.
Yeah, I agree, and because it's funny, in all that research that I did, oftentimes I found that women's history was getting erased, even in relatively neutral sources. That, so like the king and his wife, no name for the wife, like in source after source after source after source. So it's a small thing, but
Wow.
every time I found like a detail about a woman in Afghan history, I included it in the book, because often I found it like 9 sources back through the bibliographies, and it had been omitted all this time. And I just wonder if in some ways we can make, by getting people like in the West thinking about these things, we can make a bit of space for that, be that novels by women about Afghanistan now, recognizing some of the actually quite groundbreaking women in Afghan history who've been forgotten. Like, it's a small thing, but I wonder if we can make some space for it by doing it.
Wow, that sounds awesome. I hope that happens. I was going to ask more about this situation with women in Afghanistan, because it seems to me we as Westerners don't understand it very well at all. And I think, Phil, you made some reference, I think, at your launch to the fact that it's not that the Taliban don't want women to be educated. They don't necessarily want them educated in the way the Western people would educate them. Well, if I understood that correctly, yeah?
Yeah, and also that it's not just the Taliban. It's a problem in it's a problem in Afghan culture, particularly rural culture, that there's that opinion is not just the Taliban's opinion. Yeah. And so like today, there are girls going to school in Eastern Afghanistan in areas controlled by the Taliban. There are girls not going to school in Northern Afghanistan in areas controlled by the government. So that it's not cut and dry, and it's easy. I think, like for Canadian political reasons and American political reasons, it was really easy to say the Taliban, are banning school for girls, and that's why it's okay that we have soldiers there. That's why the war is okay, because who would be in favor of that? And Afghan politicians, I think, know how to push our buttons pretty well too, and are pretty clear that those bad guys on the other side of the valley, the Taliban, they're doing all this bad stuff, which is, may be true, but also not that those are Afghans who are constituents of the Afghan nation and are unhappy with how things are being run, and they're not invaders or some other, like it's a civil war, right? And also that well, it's back to the theme of the book, that when the Afghan government first put girls in school in 1919, everybody lost their minds. There was a huge uprising, a tribal uprising in the east of the country. Like 8,000 people were killed in the first 6 months of this uprising, over girls in school and child marriage, which, like the tribes rose up in favor of child marriage, right? So really in favor of the government not telling them who can get married and who can't, actually. So I don't think it's as black and white as the government wants all things well and good for women and the Taliban don't. It's a lot muddier than that, I think.
Right. Were there any women working in the legal system in Afghanistan when you were there, Elle? In any kind of capacity?
There were, but certainly not in any magnitude, and certainly not in powerful positions. And I would say, by and large, everyone who I was working with and partnering with were men.
Okay. That's interesting. And as a woman in Afghanistan at the time, I mean, you were a foreign woman. So how did you find your experience there? Did you feel like, I don't know, you had to be extra careful, or?
Do you mean from a security perspective?
Or just about even
like,
how you dressed or how you worked, how you conducted yourself, I guess.
I suppose I wouldn't have said I was behaving more conservatively than I would have in any other job. It's still a professional environment. I mean, I can say that having worked in South Sudan and needing to wear relatively formal clothes while I was working there with the weather, which was incredibly hot, you just don't think about it. It's a job, and you're behaving accordingly. And I think for myself, the sorts of standards or ideas I would have been similar to anywhere I would have worked. So I didn't feel that as much. And I felt that I had enough respect from the colleagues I was working with. And that was to my face. I have no idea what would have been happening when I wasn't there. So it's possible that it was we're going to put up with her, but we don't really appreciate her sort of situation. In my book, I talk about the third character having some unwanted attention from a judge. That actually did happen to me. I had a partner and was meeting with him with an interpreter so that we could converse easily. He did have some English. I had very little Dari, and he started to send me text messages wanting to meet with me privately. It was very uncomfortable. I don't know if that happened to anyone else. And I'd mentioned earlier that there was a point where I had suggested that perhaps another person would be a better interlocutor. And that was part of the reason for that. But I really don't know much more to what was going on, if that was something personal or if that judge was hoping to gain something professionally. I really don't know.
My Afghan colleagues,
and something that may have happened anywhere, I think, too.
True. So my male Afghan colleagues explained something to me once that that in our offices at the time, that they saw three genders. There were men, Western men, Afghan men, whatever, that's men. There were women, by which they meant Afghan women. And then the third gender that was somewhere in between were Western women, because who acted like men and could access things like men, but were not quite men. Like I don't. Does that resonate at all, Al? Like, had you heard that explanation?
Yeah, I had, and I think that it's probably fair to say in all the places I've worked as a civilian, that in a lot of times this idea of being an international person, let me get my air quotes in, an international person working in a foreign country, that you do have this other kind of persona. So it wouldn't just necessarily be thought of as a third gender in Afghanistan, but this international presence or persona that you would adopt when you were living in another person's country, but still there to try and provide some sort of support and assistance.
Yeah, that's
Yeah,
true.
I don't know. There's some, I don't know, but I felt awkward sometimes. And again, part of my drive to leave that career and come home was a bit shaped by that awkwardness.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
Interesting.
Yeah. Though I mean,
So then you just write about it.
that's right. That's right. But I mean, in all
Yeah.
that time I spent in Afghanistan, I didn't meet an Afghan woman for years. I spent literally years there before I met an Afghan woman, just because it's
Yeah.
not available. They're not available to me as as a man. You know, so it's like the
Yeah,
amount
and then
of
they're not
partition.
working in the stores and
Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah. So like the partition in society is hard to understand until you see it. And I found it a little shocking when I got home to Canada, actually, just not that there were, that you would interact with women on the streets, but like even just posters and things. I'd be like it's just strange.
So you never see a woman, like, obviously they don't work in the stores. You don't see them on the street. You don't see them interact, because I know the men do the shopping and that kind of stuff.
You would see women on the street, like in a burqa, right?
Yeah.
Covered. So they're there, but you're kind of well advised as a man not to pay any attention.
Right.
Because any kind of if you're paying any attention to them, the assumption is that you don't have good intentions.
Right.
Right. It's impolite or worse. Even asking about a colleague's family, I found that you need to be very general and speak family broadly, and you're not asking about their wives or their daughters, or like just keep it really broad. Because if you did say, "Oh, how's your wife?" that's not an acceptable question to ask someone.
Interesting. So,
You know what?
go on, Elle. Go ahead. Yeah.
I didn't find that as much, but I did have some staff, and it was mainly my staff who I was getting to be friendly with and getting to know quite well, who I did have conversations about their families with, but that was very specific and sort of invited in a way if there was an opening, because I would get to find out quite a bit about them. But then again, I'm also a woman, so maybe that made a difference. I don't know.
Yeah, and maybe more educated folks that you're dealing with as well, actually. Because like a good chunk of my staff were illiterate, right? Like that was not their job, was not writing stuff. They had other things to do, and so their worldview wasn't shaped by education. It was shaped by other things, right? So
Yeah,
I think,
that's pretty different.
yeah, because I think that's an issue too, right? Like, and this is to your point about Western humanitarian missions and etc. Like the people that you're interacting with don't necessarily represent the general population very well, right? Like
Yes, I would agree.
So sometimes I think our opinions get warped based on that, right?
Yeah.
Would you ever go back to Afghanistan, Elle, if you had the chance?
I don't know. I tend to just generally not go back to places I've been. I do have a couple of fan favorite countries that have gotten me past that idea. It was also a very specific moment in time when I worked there. I think now it's so different than when I left 12 years ago, that the way I felt about my work there and the individuals that I got to know there would be disserviced if I was to go back. So I think that's unlikely.
Yeah. And Phil, you've been back many times. Will you go back again?
Not since 2009, actually.
Okay.
So last time I was there. Actually, I was asked this question earlier today when I go back, and
Yeah.
I can't really imagine what I would go back to do.
Gotcha.
I can't imagine the reason that I would go. I'm very curious. Like, I'm very curious to see things with my own eyes and see how things are, and still a few places that I haven't visited. Um, but yeah, it's hard to imagine. It's hard to imagine, actually.
Well, maybe that's actually what Afghanistan needs. Maybe fewer Westerners going over to be in the way, as it were. If
Yeah,
that, a simplistic way of taking your thesis about your,
I guess it's not so much that we shouldn't get like. 'Cause I'm really worried actually that we're going to forget about Afghanistan.
Right.
That a lot of the mess is on us, but now it's just kind of easy to say, well, we spent 20 years. What else do they want? Well, that's and sort of wash our hands of it, and that I think is actually what a lot of Afghans are worried about as well. That they're going to get abandoned.
Interesting.
Well, the next kind of step or thinking about that I think would be potentially useful is for the Afghan government, in whatever shape that it's in, tries to define what sort of support it could find useful and reach out and find that. And thinking, as much as geopolitics can be harmful, if you have big unwieldy neighbors like Pakistan who have an interest in how powerful your government is, there can also be some good aspects to looking to neighbors and trying to figure that piece out. Because otherwise you end up, I think, with a lot of aid situations where there's not so much choice in who's doing the offering, and governments will say yes because it makes sense to have money coming in, because that's what's going to help the economy. And then you kind of regroup later about what is coming along with that money. So I don't know, it could maybe be an opportunity.
Yeah,
I don't know.
I mean, certainly Afghan governments over the last 100 years have been very adept at managing those relationships to maximize not just aid money in a callous way, but to maximize like real cooperation and aid. Shifting from the Turks to the Germans to the Americans to the Soviets, back to the Americans, and at times it actually, I would say, was effective. Like, it actually was making a difference. And I think not so much getting Western fingers out of the pie, but the current Afghan government is really hamstrung in its ability to make a deal, right? Like to make the kind of deals that are needed to create a consensus. And I think that whatever those deals look like are probably not going to be very pretty and not acceptable to a lot of Western donors. But if it brings peace, I would imagine a lot of Afghans will be okay with it.
Right.
And I think that there is maneuver room to make sure that women aren't forgotten in all that as well, which is another concern. That in the rush to find peace, we can kind of we don't need to worry about that. But I think there's room, because the positions around women are not as black and white as sometimes we think they are.
Cool. I'm going to see if there are any questions from the YouTube. Christina, do you see any questions?
I do not, but let's give some folks a second and see if any questions pop up.
Wonderful. Thank you. Do you each have a question for each other?
That's the kind of thing that you could plan,
Yeah.
One could.
Well,
I've got one.
I'll jump in and say, oh, okay, go ahead.
Oh, no, fine. If you've got it on the tip of your tongue. Not really? Okay. I'm always curious to know what people are working on next. Like, whenever I meet a writer, I'm always, oh, what are you working on? That's really what I want to know.
Okay, that's a great question. I am working on a novel, and like the novella The Finest Supermarket in Kabul, it is based in some truth at its core. And like the finest supermarket, I've started with something and thought, yes, I'm going to do this thing. And what I'm writing now is taking me in other directions that is straying a little bit further from the actual story, but in a very interesting way, because I feel like the characters are now taking the story from me and I'm writing the story for the characters. In any event, it's a book that's going to be set in Germany towards the end of the Second World War, and it's telling the story of an average German family who ends up being separated for circumstances beyond their control, and as the war is drawing to a close, are trying to figure out where the other bit of their family is and how they can meet up, because the end of the Second World War was extremely chaotic for, albeit everyone, but for regular Germans. And I think that story doesn't get told very frequently. The bulk of the stories, and rightfully so, coming out of the Second World War in Germany tend to be Jewish focused, and and that makes total sense. But it's nice to, I think, look for other perspectives.
Yeah, I would read that. I would definitely read that. I really like stories that are set in those like power vacuums where things are falling apart, and what's right and wrong isn't maybe as clear as it is in other times, and people make do in chaotic situations that you think they couldn't. I find that those stories I find really interesting.
Well, I'm gonna put the question back to you. What are you working on? And I'll just mention for everyone who's listening in that when I met Phil, I want to say a couple of weeks ago, there was a fantastic storyboard going on behind him that looked like one of those storyboards that police use in movies to find criminals. And he said that that was what he was using to write his book. So go for it.
And that one's done. So I'm like done, on to the next book.
Whoa.
Yeah. What am I? So I'm working on a movie right now, actually.
Wow.
Right at the very, very moment. Yeah. Which is partly based in truth, which is it's a true story, more or less. It's set in the 18th century during the 7 Years' War, and is about what's considered to be the very first special forces raid in American history, which was Rogers Rangers raiding the village of St. Francis. But, and it seems 18th century is a long time ago, and it seems very distant in a lot of ways. But I find that the themes are very, very modern. When you look at Afghanistan and Iraq, I think there's some very valid questions to ask about how the use of special forces and drone strikes have changed warfare to a degree, and not necessarily in a positive way. And I think those themes, you see them in the 18th century as well, because a very similar purpose. They're like a raid deep behind, enemy lines, if you will, to strike a soft target, a civilian target, for political reasons, for moral reasons. But my next book, which I'm hoping to start shortly, is going to be set in Afghanistan again. It's going to be a murder mystery thriller with an Afghan police detective set in the 1970s.
Cool. That sounds fun.
Wow.
Yeah.
Where are you planning to do your research?
Already done.
Help develop some of the ideas.
Yeah, I did it as part of Blood Washing Blood. So, yeah, 3 birds with one stone.
Yeah, right.
Excellent. Multi-purpose research. That's great.
Yeah.
No wonder you had such an extensive bibliography.
Yeah.
We do have a question from the audience. This is kind of a bit of a doozy. Imagine it's 2100. The country, I assume that means Afghanistan, is successful. What is the nature of the success, and how can Westerners help reverse engineer this?
Yeah. I can see it. I can see it in my head.
Yeah.
That's your third book?
You know what I think it is? the conflict, I think, in a nutshell, is about the balance of power between central authorities, local authorities, be they tribal or otherwise, and religious authorities. And if they can get like the balance between those three things, they can essentially satisfy the Afghan population. And so I think it looks like an Islamic country with a fairly loose central government and strong regional governance that that speak to local concerns, essentially, and give people a voice locally where politics in a lot of ways really matter. I think that's the gist of it from a political point of view. So loose governments.
My contribution to that would be the religious leaders also are able to provide their guidance on religious matters, but not overwhelmingly so that religion ends up being the biggest driver, but is potentially equal to or very much secondary to some of the political concerns, and quite frankly, economic concerns too.
Yeah. But I think like Islam can form that cultural glue as well, right?
Yeah.
Because trying to push it aside hasn't really worked so far.
Yeah, no, but I think if as an outsider looking in, when that's the main driver of how you're conducting your economy and your business and other out there items, that's a tough one as well.
Yeah.
Because I don't think that's, really, this might be a whole other conversation, purpose of religion.
Oh, yeah. There's a book to be written about that for sure.
Maybe a few.
Yeah. Well, I think that's true. Like it's that balance, right? It's that to find that balance because the Taliban obviously tried to push the stick hard on the religious authority, and that didn't really work either, right? Because they were opposed in a lot of parts of the country who didn't find that acceptable, right? And we forget too that Afghanistan's not monolithic in terms of its religion, right? It's there are other religious minorities there.
We have another question.
Very much so.
Is Afghanistan participating more proactively with the international community, like in Iraq or in Iran, or does that need to be driven by economics?
I think you see them trying.
Yeah.
Right? Like I guess how you define participating more proactively with the international community, like at things like, if you remember the Afghan girls robotics team that got international acclaim, like that's super cool. And I think that's at the kind of level where it's possible for them to have more interaction with the rest of the world through the Olympics, with Afghan athletes.
Wasn't there a song competition of some sort?
Was, yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, it was huge.
And right, to be honest, reading positive stories coming out of Afghanistan is also really wonderful.
Absolutely.
Oh yeah, that robotic story I just thought was the most awesome thing ever.
Yeah. But I think there is to the question, there is an aspect of economics is like there's not money to spare for frills, and the Afghan government actually, their budget, they're very much constrained in terms of how they can use that budget because it's given to them by the international community for very specific purposes, and so they don't actually have the ability to set the agenda in a way that most governments do. So I think they get to interact proactively when we, give them the funding to do it. specifically.
Right. Okay. Elle, will you ever write about Afghanistan again, or was Finest Supermarket in Kabul the last time? Or never say never.
I have a feeling that that's the story I wanted to write, and that I do want to move on. I'm working on the book I already mentioned, and I have a few more ideas of books that I would like to write. In fact, I'm very intrigued by the idea of writing a series set in Toronto in the 1910s.
Ooh.
So I think I just don't have time. I've got so many other ideas.
So many books, so little time.
Yeah, it's a good problem to have, actually.
It's a very good problem to have.
There it is.
Phil, so are any of these other books likely to come to light of day very soon?
You know what? I've been ghostwriting a bunch of books right now. So a lot of my work will see the light of day, just not with my name attached to it. So no, there's nothing under my own name that has a publication date to it just yet, anyways. But there is some stuff that I'm pitching. So hopefully,
Okay. All right. Well, I think we're now past the hour mark. So I think it doesn't look like we have any other questions. So I think we're going to sign off. I'm just going to give Elle a couple minutes to just tell us again about her book.
Sure. Thanks, Heather. So this is my book. The cover is the actual supermarket sign, because again, this is set in it takes place in Afghanistan, and it's about a bombing in a supermarket that's a real supermarket. And it takes place over one day. What you get to do as a reader is follow three completely different characters. One is an Afghan politician, one is an American journalist, and the third one's a Canadian human rights lawyer. And they all come into the space of the bomb attack. And as the story evolves, they all come into each other's stories as well.
Cool, thank you. And Phil, in the Reader's Digest version, you tell us again about Blood Washing Blood.
Yeah, but like for anyone who's listening, you should read Elle's book. It really rings true. Like if that was Wazir Akbar Khan, like you nailed it, Elle. So it like that really. Anyways, it rung true for me, so I would suggest that you give it a try. So Blood Washing Blood is a relatively thick history that talks about really the roots of the Afghan conflict, the deep roots, the 100 years ago roots, and explains how we got here today. Or there's also it's hard to. This Shall Be a House of Peace, which is my novel. That's really the origin story of the Taliban. And gives you an idea of what Afghanistan was like during the Civil War and what people do to survive. So,
all right. Well, there you have it, folks. Blood Washing Blood is available from Dundurn Press. The Finest Supermarket in Kabul is available from Quattro Books. They are both available at all your fine Canadian bookstores. Support your indies. Thank you very much for listening. Good night and take care.